Hello, and welcome to Due Process the Interviews. This is Trevor Wadden. Before getting to today's interview, I wanted to again remind people that this feed, Due Process the Interviews, should be understood as a side podcast feed for our main show, which is simply called Due Process. Again, we're in the process of producing our first season for Due Process, which will be a documentary-style podcast following the narrative of a case while also examining Canada's criminal justice system. Our first season will examine the BC case of Peter Beckett, who was charged with the 2010 murder of his wife. Beckett has undergone 2 jury trials and many twists and turns, and we look forward to discussing these twists and turns and Beckett's case in the upcoming first season. In terms of timeline, my goal is to have the first season released by November of 2021, and again, we are a small team here, and we're working to achieve this goal, so stay tuned for further updates. My email is in the show notes, so please reach out with feedback, and please subscribe to both feeds, both Due Process the Interviews and Due Process if you like what you hear. Moving on, today I'm speaking with Jeffrey Deskovic, who was wrongfully convicted of the murder and rape of a classmate in 1990, for which he spent 16 years in prison. Jeff's case is from New York State, but as you will hear, wrongful convictions are not unique to the United States, and they happen in Canada. They are well documented in Canada, and Jeff's story and the injustices he endured are reminiscent of some of Canada's most notable wrongful convictions, which is part of the reason I was grateful to have an opportunity to speak to Jeff. It was really wonderful to have Jeff on the show, and we discussed a variety of issues, including his background and upbringing, the murder of his classmate, interactions he had with the police, the interrogation and coerced confession, his time spent in jail, strategies he employed to survive jail and not lose hope, his exoneration, and his efforts now as a lawyer and advocate to avoid wrongful convictions. Jeff's story is truly difficult to comprehend in terms of the injustices that piled up against him, but it is also a story of perseverance and heart. It was wonderful to speak with him, and also a great reminder of why we need to constantly strive to improve and reevaluate our justice system and the manner in which we conduct investigations and prosecutions. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and if you do, please consider sharing this episode or leaving a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. And with that, here is Jeffrey Deskovic. Hello, and welcome to Due Process. This is Trevor Wadden. Today I'm speaking with wrongful conviction exoneree, educator, lawyer, and criminal justice reform advocate Jeffrey Deskovic. In 1990, at the age of 17, Jeffrey was wrongfully convicted of the murder of a classmate in a small town in New York State. He spent nearly 16 years in prison for a crime he did not commit until DNA testing in 2006 finally confirmed his innocence. As Jeffrey and I will discuss today, his wrongful conviction was a true miscarriage of justice, having many of the hallmarks of wrongful convictions, including police misconduct, the use of demeanor evidence, improper police interviewing, tunnel vision, and prosecutorial misconduct. Since being exonerated, Jeff has gone on to become a lawyer, educator, and advocate. He has started his own foundation, which is dedicated to exonerating the wrongfully convicted, helping exonerees with their recovery, and lobbying for criminal justice reform. Jeff has been gracious enough to join us today to discuss his tragic yet inspiring story of resilience and perseverance. And Jeff, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. It's a real privilege to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jeff, I want to start by acknowledging that although you're an American, our show is focused on Canada's criminal justice system specifically, your wrongful conviction is not unique to one country. Canada has many examples of wrongful convictions. And what struck me with your case, Jeff, is how similar it was to the cases of David Milgaard and Guy Paul Morin in Canada. And they're 2 of Canada's most notable wrongful convictions. So the first question I'll ask you, Jeff, is it fair to frame the issue of wrongful convictions generally as an international problem, or rather one that isn't confined by borders?
100%, yes, because the same systemic deficiencies that lead to wrongful convictions in one country lead to them in another. Now, there may be something particular, say, to Canada. So there's the, I forgot what it's called, big guy or big man, this weird entrapment thing that goes on in Canada that's unique to Canada. But that's kind of an outlier. That's kind of an exception. In general, all the deficiencies that lead to wrongful convictions in one jurisdiction, one country, definitely lead to them in another. So why not learn lessons from one country and apply to another country in terms of steps to take relative to wrongful conviction prevention?
Right. And that makes sense. And speaking of lessons, Jeff, why is it important for you to continue to share your story and messages around wrongful convictions?
Well, to educate the public about wrongful conviction. Certainly, there are the issues that caused my wrongful conviction, but then beyond that, I mean, I'm an advocate. I've become an attorney, and I have a master's degree as well. My thesis is on wrongful conviction causes and reform, and so one of the reasons why I do share my story is to be able to then speak about the causes of wrongful conviction in general. Not just the issues in my case, but above and beyond. But in addition to that, in order for me to continue to be an even more effective advocate, it's definitely important for me to build my profile even further. And then also, I want to bring attention to my organization, the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice. And as goes I, to some extent, as goes the organization, and to some extent, lesser than that, as goes the issue. So for all of those reasons, and also hoping to find some people who help me along the way in terms of the mission of fighting wrongful conviction, I share my story.
Right. And it's an important story. And we'll get into discussing your foundation later on today, Jeff, and the great work that you are doing. But we'll jump into it because we do have a lot of material to cover and a lot of different topics I want to discuss with you today. And we'll start with just a little bit more background about where you grew up. And can you tell us just about Peaksville, New York, what your childhood was like and the background?
Of course, it was a small city. It was in the suburb, population of approximately 25,000 people. I would say that it was ethnically diverse and it was middle class. Growing up, I kind of lived a double life. I didn't really think of it that way at the time, but it really was in hindsight. So there was my life in school and my life outside of school. So in school, the kids were a little bit older than me, and I really wasn't into drinking and party and organized sports, and they were. So I was kind of on the fringes of the society there. So as a result, I was quiet and to myself. Whereas after school in the apartment complex that I grew up in, there were a lot of kids that lived there and lived in the surrounding areas that would come over, and I would be one of the main kids. Kind of whatever I would suggest would be what we would do. If that was we were going to ride bikes or play Monopoly or go swimming or play basketball, go to the movies, do video games, and a whole host of things. That was my background growing up. My father was never involved in my life in any aspect at all. That'll become a factor in the story as we unfold it. And lastly, prior to being a teenager, the career that I wanted to have when I grew up was actually to be a police officer. So again, that'll intersect with the story as we unfold it.
Okay. So your father wasn't around, Jeff, but did you have siblings or a bigger family?
I did. I did. I had a brother who was 3.5 years younger than me, and we also lived with, so it was my mother, my brother, and my grandmother.
And what happened specifically on November 15th, 1989?
Yeah, a classmate of mine named Angela Correa, who was a immigrant from Colombia. She'd been in the country for about a year and a half. She led a very sheltered life, as I understood it. She never went anywhere unless she was accompanied by her older sister or her parents. So she went missing. Well, and specifically, as I benefit of hindsight, she was in one of her classes in high school was photography class, and the professor assigned all the students to take pictures of foliage, and he assigned a buddy system in which the female students would be paired with a male student. But the male student assigned to Angela played hooky on the assignment, so she went home, and her sister went to the restroom, and when she came back out, Angela had left, and she went to the park to do her assignment. And unfortunately, she met a drug addict who was high and in the park that day, and he murdered and raped her. And so therefore she went missing, and her body was found a couple days later, November 17th, 1989. And that really shook Peekskill pretty bad because murders were pretty rare. There were town hall meetings held where progress on investigation was discussed, safety tips were discussed. There were a bunch of news articles in the local daily newspaper. And, parents were coming right to dropping their kids off to school and picking them up at 3 o'clock and bringing them straight home. The state police were kind of breathing down the neck of the local Peekskill police also, because at some point in the investigation, the victim's family felt like the Peekskill police were not that experienced, and they asked the state police to take over the investigation, which they did not, but they did let the Peekskill police know that they had been contacted. So there was a lot of pressure on the police to solve the crime.
And specifically, Jeff, did you know Angela well?
I did not know her well. She was in 2 of my classes as a freshman, one as a sophomore. I knew her name. She knew mine. I think we chatted briefly twice in 2 years, but that was really the extent of it. We were not even really on a hi-bye basis.
And it's important to remember, how old were you at the time?
16.
16. Okay. And the police put a lot of stock, which we'll discuss later, with some of your behavior, the way that you were reacting to the news of Angela's death. Can you walk us through receiving that news and how you felt?
Sure, I received the news through the daily newspaper. It said, teen body found, and it referenced she was found naked from the waist down. And, this was really my first brush with death as a sensitive teenager. So I did have an emotional reaction to that, which the police thought was odd considering what my relationship with her was, which was, as I said, not really any relationship. So they interpreted that as being some sort of outward sign that I was sorry for what I had done. I got on the police radar originally because the police interviewed many students from the high school, and some of them told the police that they might want to speak to me. And then I guess maybe rounding it out was they got a psychological profile from the NYPD, which purported to have the psychological characteristics of the actual perpetrator. And I had the misfortune of matching that. So for about 6 weeks, the police played this type of cat and mouse game with me, in which half the time they would speak to me as a suspect, and then when they would push too hard and I'd become frightened and I'd want to get away from them, Jeff as this junior detective helper theme was developed by them. So they would say things like, the kids won't talk freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear anything. Stop in from time to time. They would ask me opinion questions and congratulate me that my opinion was correct. I began to look up to the officer who was pretending to be my friend in the old good cop, bad cop routine. I began to look up to him as a father figure. And again, my age being 16 and wanting to be a police officer when I grew up, I mean, that was kind of, I guess you might say that was the right, that tactic that they utilized was, how they were able to pull the wool over my eyes. So eventually they got me to agree to a lie detector test by telling me that some new information had come into the file and they wanted to share that with me, and that would allow me to be more helpful to them. First, though, I would have to take and pass a polygraph test. And so the next day, rather than report to the school, I went to the police station. But instead of giving me the examination at the police station, they instead drove me to the town of Brewster, which is in Putnam County, New York. So they drove me across county lines 40 minutes away by car. There were 3 police officers who came with me from Peekskill. They put me in the car to travel with the officer who had been pretending to be my friend. The other 2 officers were in a different vehicle. And they brought me to this polygraphist's office. So he was a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator, but he was dressed like a civilian. He was pretending not to be law enforcement. He never read me my rights. I had no attorney present. They didn't give me anything to eat the entire time I was there. They gave me a 4-page brochure which explained how the polygraph worked, but it had a lot of big words in it that I didn't understand. But then I figured, what does it matter? I'm here to help the police. Let's just get on with it. And from there, he put me in a small room and gave me countless cups of coffee. It seems clear in hindsight that the purpose of that was to get me nervous. I think I drank 6 or 7 cups. And then he attached me to a polygraph machine, and then he launched into his 3rd-degree tactics. So he invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. And as each hour passed by, my fear increased in proportion to the time. Towards the end, he said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the polygraph test result that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." And when he said that to me, that really shot my fear through the roof. And at that point, the officer who had been pretending to be my friend came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he had been holding them off but couldn't do so any longer, that I had to help myself. But then he added, "Just tell them what they want to hear and go home. You're not going to be arrested." Being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long term, only being concerned with my safety in the moment, I was in fear of my life because the fact that I didn't know where I was and no one else knew where I was either loomed large in my mind. I was overwhelmed emotionally and psychologically, and there was this push-pull dynamic, possibility of harm on one hand, and then this false life preserver on the other. So I took the out which he offered, and I made up a story based on the information she had given me that day and that I had received in the 6 weeks run up to that. By the time everything was said and done, I had collapsed on the floor into a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. Obviously, I was arrested. I was charged with a murder and rape.
Wow, yeah, and that's just a harrowing story, Jeff, and just incomprehensible, I think, for most people to hear that. And there's a lot in what you just said there to kind of unpack. And I just want to go back and just expand on when the police started to initially speak to you. Do you understand now why some of your schoolmates had said that they should focus on you or talk to you? Was that ever explained to you at all?
That was never explained to me at all. I mean, other than just that I was just quiet to myself. I mean, no one ever told me why that made me stick out. I mean, I've thought about it myself on my own. And I think that perhaps people think that people that are quiet and to themselves commit heinous crimes. I guess that's the underlying theory. At the same time, I do think that that's kind of ridiculous. And even though I was emotional and I almost had virtually no relationship with Angela, but at the same time, this murder really shook up the whole city of Peekskill. Many people were impacted emotionally to the point that free mental health counseling was offered to anybody who wanted it. Many people attended, like I had went to 3 of the different sessions of the wake, but many people went to four sessions. So in that aspect of it, I don't think I was all that different from a lot of people.
Right. And one of the areas we're looking at, Jeff, in our podcast is the focus on what in Canada anyways referred to as post-offense conduct and how dangerous that, I don't even know if you can call it evidence based on how dangerous it is to put a lot of stock in someone's behavior after an alleged crime. So it's frightening if when police officers or investigators will look at those types of things. And one thing that I'm interested in discussing with you is just with respect to when the police were talking to you, you indicated you were primarily by yourself throughout those conversations.
Yeah, I was by myself in all of those conversations.
So was your mom aware of what was happening? Did the police ever explain to her, hey, Jeff, we think Jeff might have something to do with this, or we're interested in talking to Jeff? What was your mom's role in this?
She did not know. I mean, I told her after the first meeting that I had with the police, and then, so she knew then that time, but she told me, not to talk with the police any further. But, I was raised, the police are our friend and they're there to help us. And I knew I didn't do anything. I knew I didn't know anything. And then they were acting like they needed my help to solve the crime. And so I kept interacting with them despite what her wishes were. And she did not realize that over the next 6 weeks that I was having interaction with the police, and they certainly never told her.
Okay. Do you remember having a conversation with the police, Jeff, that you had an interest in policing? You said it was a theme. That was an active conversation that kept happening over and over.
I don't remember. Honestly, I don't remember if I ever mentioned that or not. It's possible I might have, but I don't have a memory of that. I mean, it sounds logical because, I mean, why else would they have adopted that tactic, to come up with that scenario? But
Right. But importantly, that was something that was going through your mind, that this was an area that you wanted to potentially be a career for you.
yes.
So let's just go back to the polygraph, Jeff. When you were in the room, was any of this recorded at all?
No, it was not recorded. There was no videotape. There was no audio tape. And ultimately, as it turned out, there was no signed confession either. I never signed anything. It was just their word for it. And, that kind of leads into the trial some, whenever we get there. I just want to mention that when they did come to court and they testified, they left the threat and false promise out of their testimony. And, and that was no accident. I mean, those were 2 illegal tactics that they engaged in, per American law.
And can you just expand on that a little bit in terms of the threat and false promise? What do you mean by that?
Sure. When the officer pretending to be my friend told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he had been holding them off but couldn't do so any longer, that I had to help myself. I mean, that's a threat. He's telling me I'm going to be harmed, not by him, but by other people, but he's conveying it all the same. So that's what I mean when I say that they're the threat. And in terms of the false promise, what I mean by that is he told me, just tell them what they want to hear and they'll stop what they're doing and you can go home. Afterwards, you're not going to be arrested. That's a false promise because I was arrested, and that was the whole point of why they were interrogating me, is they wanted to get a statement which they could then use as evidence for the purpose of arresting me.
Right. It just seems so unbelievable hearing stories like that and to think that investigators would behave in that manner. But certainly there's countless examples of those tactics being used. And you talked about how they took you 45 minutes away, Jeff, and gave you lots of coffee and you didn't really have a lot of breaks. Do you remember how long this polygraph and interrogation lasted for?
I do. I was there for about 6.5 to 7 hours. Which, by the way, per normal polygraph procedure. So the procedure that the polygraphers used was called the Arthur method. And first of all, per that method, because there's a high correlation between the usage of that method and false confessions, there's supposed to be a recording, which he didn't utilize. So that was one thing that was not correct. That was big. But another thing was there was a polygraph expert who had said that the longest that it could be, that someone could be on the polygraph would be like 3.5 hours. And in this situation, I was more than double that. So this polygraph expert found that to be shocking. And both him and a false confession expert, Saul Cassidy, was considered to be the leading false confession expert in the United States. He wrote that this was actually no polygraph test at all. This was actually an interrogation that was masked as a polygraph.
And it's important to recognize as well that polygraphs are very unreliable as a tool of evidence to begin with.
Right, but yeah, frightened, innocent people can fail the test. I mean, the whole premise of the polygraph is that when a person tells a lie, that they'll become nervous, and the nervousness will result in an increased pulse rate, and it's actually the pulse rate which is measured by the machine. So anything, caffeine or fear, would make somebody's pulse rate speed up. And so despite it not being admissible as evidence unless both sides agree because of the reasons that we've mentioned, the judge at the trial came up with this backdoor rule where he allowed the polygraphers to repeatedly tell the jury that I failed the polygraph.
And one of the things I read, Jeff, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but why your quote-unquote confession was supposed to be convincing was because of the detail you supplied or the information you supplied about
Right.
the crime scene and the crime. How do you respond to that? Because I know your response is that generally they were providing this information to you, but can you walk us through this approach that the police took with you?
Sure. I mean, they told me that, her keychain was missing, and they told me that they found her walking some distance from the body. And I remember once they took me to the crime scene, and this detective said to me that, they thought that she was attacked in one area, and that there was a chase, and then the body was found in a different area. They said that her body had been dragged and covered with leaves. So they thought it was almost like whoever was attacked her then had remorse, and they were trying to protect her from the elements. So I got that from them during that trip. Another time I just remember something else. They asked me, well, what route do you think she took? I was very familiar with Peekskill, so I knew where her house was. And so, logically speaking, I could see where she took a particular street, which was adjacent to her house, up, and then take a right and a left, and then the park was there. And so I told them that I thought that was probably the route that she went, because that would be the quickest way to get there from her house. And they confirmed that. They said, yeah, they told me that, yes, that's correct. So that's what I mean. Another thing was that they showed me pictures of her at the crime scene, being found naked from the waist down. So they showed me pictures of that. And I remember a couple of times prior to the coerced confession that they asked me, do you think that there was any kind of jealousy there? Do you think that whoever killed her knew that she was going to meet somebody there and they didn't want her to? And, that might have been why somebody killed her. So they asked me that several times, and that was how I latched onto that and utilized that in the worst false confession that I gave.
And Jeff, I think this view is becoming less and less with the more information and more publicity around wrongful convictions. But I do think it still exists in our society that it's a naive belief that only the guilty will confess to a crime. And I just want to revisit the psychological pressure that you were under during that interrogation. Can you tell us again just the pressure you were feeling throughout those, nearly 7 hours that you were being questioned?
Sure. Let me just add for general context, and then I'll get into me. Just wanted to share that coerced false confessions have caused wrongful convictions in 25% of the DNA-proven wrongful convictions, and that while adults have given some coerced false confessions, that particularly vulnerable populations are youth and people with mental health issues, which, I definitely was a youth. In terms of the psychological pressure that I was under, I'm attached to a polygraph, and he's, first of all, the fact that he's in my personal space, and that he's yelling at me and he keeps asking me the same questions over and over again, and it was clear to me that he thought that the polygraphers thought that I was guilty. And I really was not used to talking to adult males very much anyway, because my father was not involved in my life. And, I very rarely visited with any of my aunts and uncles. So even just talking to an adult male was something unusual for me, much less somebody who was conducting themselves in that ferocious type of manner. And look, at the end, I just wanted to get out of there. I would have said anything. And when, I just wanted to go home. And when he told me, they're not going to arrest you, that became the thing that I latched onto. It was down to that.
Okay. And when you're in the room and getting questioned, Jeff, was there a refusal to accept your denials, or was that even something?
Yes, there was a refusal to accept the denials. I mean, he kept on with his asking me the same questions over and over again as if I didn't even issue the denial. It was clear to me he wasn't convinced that it wasn't having any impacting on him.
And that's one of the things in the conversations we've had with forensic psychologists here in Canada, Jeff, that's one of the things they are concerned about with some of was known as the Reed style of interrogation, where
Right.
the investigator just will kind of put the hand up in the face and say, no, 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 Jeff, we're past this. We know that you've done it. We need to get to why you did it and get this off your chest, sort of thing.
Right, that's referred to as taking innocence off of the table. So there was that. And another aspect of the coercive read technique is, developing themes, that explain criminal behavior in a way that minimizes culpability. It almost makes it like understandable, right? And the danger in that is people don't get punished for doing things that are understandable. But Officer was pretending to be my friend. I mean, he utilized that in offering the whole jealous theme. And, you didn't want it. I could understand that. You wanted her not to see somebody else. You were interested in her for you. So there was that. But then another aspect of the read technique also is just taking a suspect out that's the whole theory of taking a suspect out from familiar territory. And here they kind of did that to the extreme. It wasn't merely taking me to the police station, but then taking me out of county. So that was another aspect of it. And minimization, even the false promise, minimization, minimizing what the seriousness is of the consequences.
Did you understand when you left the room that day that you were going to be charged with her murder?
No. Here's how I learned. So when I finished this, I collapsed on the floor in this fetal position. Then the lieutenant who oversaw everything, he burst into the room yelling, saying, "What did I just say? I have to repeat it all over again. That he had to hear it, and that we could be there all night if I wanted it to be." So I had to regurgitate the story. I was finally given something to eat. After that, I was given a hamburger to eat, and it was time to return back to the police station. They put me in handcuffs, and I asked, well, why am I being put in handcuffs? I mean, I was told that I was not going to be arrested, and they just said safety, which didn't really make any sense. So we drove to Peekskill, and they told me that they were going to order a pizza and that we would share pizza together at the police station, which we had done previous to that. And then the good cop disappeared. I didn't see where he went, but I did see, and the lieutenant also left my vision. But the other officer who had played the role of more aggressive partner of the two, he was still around. So I'm in the police station. I see him. I'm eating pizza, and periodically I was interrupted by a uniformed police officer who was carrying out various aspects of processing. And eventually he got to the point where he took my fingerprints and he put ink on my fingers and everything. And I remember I got very angry when that happened, and I said to the officer who I knew, I said, "What is he doing that for? I'm over here trying to eat pizza. I've got ink all over my hands." And he said, "Oh, he has a right to do that." And I said, "What do you mean he has a right to do that? I was told that I wasn't being arrested." And that's when he said, "Oh, you are being charged with the crime." And that was when I realized that I had been arrested.
And did the gravity of the situation then settle on you, Jeff? I mean,
It did.
you're 16, but
It did it did to the extent that I could understand it. I mean, that understanding was limited, but I certainly understood how. So to some extent, I had some sense of how it really had been betrayed and what happened. I remember feeling angry. I remember feeling frightened. I remember no longer being interested in the pizza anymore.
And then do you remember when your mother found out about this?
Yeah. They asked me if I wanted to call her, and I remember I told them no, because her telling me she didn't want me to talk to the police anymore. I mean, that was on my mind also. So I felt kind of silly. I felt kind of stupid for that, but they decided to call her anyway. And at some point she arrived at the police station, and we spoke on the phone with the phone separated by a glass. And she asked me, "Well, what happened? Did you get arrested?" And I told her, they told me that I was not going to be arrested. They told me that I was not going to go to prison. And at some point shortly after that, I was driven to the county jail.
To me, again, just unbelievable. But at that point, you still had not spoken to a lawyer one time.
Right, correct.
Okay. So you're taken from the police station to the jail, and then talk us through.
Well, wait. Just before they took me from the police station to the jail, I just remembered something. No, the judge, I stayed the holding cell area at the police station. The judge came and arraigned me, which means that he read off the charges. And an attorney did come, but he spoke for like 10, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, and it was not very long. And I asked, well, don't we get a chance to say anything? And I was just told that wasn't the place for it. But I guess the main point I'm saying is I didn't have a chance to have any kind of prolonged conversation with the attorney. He didn't ask me what happened. He didn't explain anything to me, really. He just said the judge is simply going to read the charges against you. You'll enter a plea if not guilty, and that's it. Don't say anything else. The judge doesn't want to be a witness to anything. Now, when I asked about, well, is there anything we could say on my behalf? He said, no, this is not the time and place for that. That's later.
Okay, and this is probably my unfamiliarity with the American criminal justice process there, Jeff, but was there a bail hearing at some point for you?
Yeah, at some point there was a bail hearing. That was like 34 days into the county jail. I had a bail hearing, and bail was set at $50,000. And my mother had a boyfriend at the time that was a prominent businessman, and he put the bail money up for me, and that was how I was released.
So you were in jail though for those 34 days?
I was, yes.
That just seems like such a long time for a bail hearing to happen.
I agree. It had to do with the American process. So first the case, went to the local court, which really didn't have any jurisdiction in it to set bail. So I had to wait for the case to then get transferred over to the county jail. To the county court, and then the county court is who set bail. But yeah, it is. I agree with you. It definitely is a long time, and I was really frightened being in jail. I'd never been arrested for anything before, and I had been charged as an adult, so I was put in the county jail, which had adults in it as well, and just the idea of being in this unfamiliar environment where there was correction officers in charge and other prisoners, and then learning that there's vigilante mentality where people are convicted of sex offenses. So I was very, very frightened for that. And so it was really just a kind of a horrendous process all the way around. When I would go to court, they would wake everybody up because they're dealing in lots of people. So they would wake everyone up around 5 o'clock in order to leave for the court around 8:30. They would put everybody, they would overcrowd the bullpen area, the cell area in the jail. They would have way too many people in it. There was no fan. There was no ventilation. There weren't enough seats for people. Everyone was just like crowded together like a bunch of sardines. And we were put in handcuffs and having leg irons on as well, all linked together, a whole row of prisoners. It was kind of reminiscent of what a chain gang might look like. And then, it was hard to walk that way. And then they would put us in the back of a van where, again, there's way too many people. It's not sufficient, ventilation. And then you'd be put in the holding area of the court. And you'd be down there basically with nothing to do for like hours and hours on end until they call you. And then you make a short court appearance that would last like 3 or 4 minutes, if that. And then you'd be brought back down and you'd be in there waiting again until court was done for the whole day. So you might be in that holding area around 9:30, and you don't leave until like 5 o'clock at night.
So you have to wait for everybody to go through their court process.
Correct, yeah. And then again, they put everyone in handcuffs and put you in the back of the vehicle and bring you back to the county jail, where you'd again be in the holding area, the bullpen area they call it, until they finally move you back to wherever in the jail you're being housed at. It was extremely uncomfortable process, is what I'm getting at.
Right. And I do want to talk to you more about just your experiences with prison life, but I just want to talk about your trial. So you're released 34 days after you were arrested and charged with it. And then can you walk us through kind of your mindset leading up to the trial? What was that like?
Sure. So when I got bailed out, I thought that I was going back to my life, but actually there would never be any going back to that. So it was a lot of prejudicial pretrial publicity. I was a hated figure in Peekskill, specifically. It was really intense there. I was really disliked in the county. I was not allowed to return back to school. And so while my case was open, everybody hated me, thought I was guilty. So I had very few friends that were willing to get together with me socially. And as to the few that were, their parents were not willing to let them play with me because they thought that I was a murderer and rapist. So that's what that was like. I thought my life was basically over. And so I made a suicide attempt. I took an entire bottle of extra strength Tylenols and I went to sleep, intending to never wake up again. But I did wake up. I was rushed to the hospital and they pumped my stomach out. But the end result of all of that was that I was involuntarily committed to a mental institution, and it took 6 months for them to let me out because the psychologists and other mental health professionals there, they were kind of in a CYA mentality, and they thought, well, they said, well, you're okay now, but there's always ebbs and flows throughout the trial and leading up to it. And, your reason for making the suicide attempt was, you thought you were going to lose the trial and that your life was over, and you might think that again at any time and you might make another suicide attempt. So they were not willing to release me, even though they were simultaneously telling me that I was okay. And it was only when I was transferred from one psychiatric center to a different one in a neighboring county that finally, they saw that I was fine and they were willing to let me be released. But I think that my mentality, I went from feeling like my life was over to eventually believing that everything was going to turn out okay. So I would, from visits from my mother and some limited visits from my extended family, and everybody was, kept telling me that, everything's going to be okay. The court system's accurate. We know that you're innocent, so you'll be found not guilty and you'll be able to pull all this behind you. So I started out skeptical of that, but at some point I bought into that. And so my mindset kind of changed, and eventually I adopted that viewpoint that they were advocating me to. So in terms of the trial, so before the trial, the DNA test result came in from the FBI lab, which showed that semen found in the victim didn't match me. So my lawyer tried to get the case thrown out based on that, but the prosecutor claimed that he got the medical examiner to commit fraud, and he said that he suddenly remembered that he forgot to document medical evidence that he said showed that the Angela had been promiscuous, which is what opened the door for the prosecutor to argue that she might have slept with somebody else prior to my murdering and raping her, and that's how the DNA could have not matched me, and yet I was still guilty. And they got away with that because the victim's family was not coming to court, so they had no idea of what was being said about her in the courtroom. Taking it a step further, he named another youth by name that he claimed had slept with the victim, but he never set the proper evidentiary foundation, so he never asked him for take a DNA test. They never even called him as a witness. He just made the unsupported argument to the jury. Now, simultaneous to that, hair on the body also was determined to be from Negroid and Mongoloid ethnicity, which, I'm pretty much as white as you can get. So again, the prosecutor resorted to arguing by inference rather than established fact. So he claimed that the hairs must have come from the Vietnamese medical examiner and his African-American assistant, but he never proved that. And I've learned since I was exonerated that when the hair expert found out what his explanation was going to be, he asked the prosecutor to get hair samples from them so that he could make the actual determination, but he was never given those hair samples. So in terms of the trial, first of all, my lawyer rarely met with me. Whenever he would meet with me, and I tried to explain to him I was innocent and what happened in the interrogation room, he was always shutting me up. One time he told me he didn't care if I was guilty or innocent. Another time he started out, he wanted me to agree to let him put an insanity defense in, which, I said absolutely not. No, I didn't do this. We're not going to explain why I did it. We're going to argue that I didn't do it because I didn't. So here's how my lawyer failed me. So he never introduced my alibi witness. I was actually playing wiffle ball when the crime happened. He literally never cross-examined this medical examiner whose fraud was so big. He literally asked him no questions. He didn't explain to the jury the significance of the DNA not matching me. He never used that to argue that proved that the confession was coerced and false. Sometimes he argued to the jury the confession never happened. Other times he argued that it happened, but it was coerced. And at still other times he was arguing that it happened, but it was false. So you can't take that kind of scattershot approach because people are going to think that you'll say anything. So I wanted to testify at the hearing to give evidence as to the threat and false promise, but he wouldn't allow me to testify. When you defend a case where there's a false confession, you have to answer that confession. You have to explain it. You have to try to disprove it and bring it all together in your closing argument, but he didn't do any of that. Lastly, he should have never represented me because of a conflict of interest. So this other youth that the prosecutor was falsely saying had slept with the victim was represented by another member of that same public defender office, and specifically by the lawyer who was supposed to be supervising him on my case. And so that conflict prevented the defense from asking him to give a DNA sample, and it prevented the defense from calling him as a witness. And so the following irregularities happened during the trial. So firstly, the judge kept allowing the polygraphist to tell the jury that I failed the polygraph. And another thing was that the victim's clothes, including her bra, had been entered into evidence. And the jury asked to see the bra. And that intersected with one of the statements in my false confession, in which I said that I ripped her bra off. So there's some bras that you cannot rip off from a body, the way that they're built. So when they asked to see the bra, that's when the judge announced that the clothes had been left in the courtroom over the weekend, and that apparently the janitors thought that it was garbage, and so they threw it out. And so the bra was not around anymore, and he refused to declare a mistrial, and he substituted a photograph in which he said that you could almost see the bra. He substituted that picture for the actual bra. And last thing I'll mention is that the jury sent a note out on the third day of deliberation, and they asked, well, if we don't reach a verdict, will we be sequestered over the Christmas holiday? Which means, would they have to stay in the hotel and still have limited contact with people on the outside and limited access to newspapers and television? And the judge said, yes, you will be sequestered. And I learned since then that at that point that they sent the note out, it was already 11-1 to find me guilty. There was one holdout juror that did not think I was guilty, and he said that they were pressuring him, and that once they sent the note out, that really ratcheted the pressure up on him, and that neither the other people nor he wanted to be sequestered over the Christmas holiday. And so that was why he switched his vote from not guilty to guilty. And so the end result of it all was I was found guilty and given a 15 to life sentence, which the judge gave me, even though he said maybe you are innocent. He gave me the sentence instead of overturning the conviction.
Wow. So Jeff, hindsight's 2020. You're looking back, you can see these injustices very clearly. But when you were in the courtroom as a teenager, did you realize? Did you have a sense of all the injustices that were stacking up against you?
No, I did not fully understand. And that was a situation that was exasperated by my defense attorney because he refused to allow my mother or any other male relative, any other adult relative rather, of either gender, to be involved in any of the conversations with him about the proceedings or even about strategic choices. I mean, like, for example, we had, the decision whether to testify or not, and he basically made that decision for me, but he didn't have any discussion with me and an adult of mature judgment to discuss the ramifications or implications, both pro and con, of doing that. And in a similar way, he did not consult with anybody with me, allow anyone to be there on my behalf when we decided whether we were going to have a bench trial, which is decided by a judge, or a jury trial. So that added to my being not fully understanding what was going on in the courtroom, somewhat, but not fully.
Okay. Was your lawyer appointed, or was this somebody that your family had hired?
He was appointed. We didn't have enough money to hire anybody. Lawyers told us that they wanted $50,000 just as a retainer, just to get started. We didn't have that kind of money.
And while you're in the courtroom, Jeff, as a teenager, did you have this idea that your innocence would shine through? That's a common thing that I see
Yes.
in wrongful convictions, that people think that the justice system is going to work. They're going to see that I'm innocent.
Yes, I did have that. And one other thing I wanted to add is that every time I made a court appearance, it was like a major media moment with virtually all the coverage from a guilt presumptive oriented perspective. So that added like a frightening element of it to me, to see me in the newspapers and being written about in this type of way. But despite that feeling like a frightening and out of control, I did have that thought, like you said, that, my innocence is going to shine through. They'll see I'm innocent and I'm going to be found not guilty.
In Canada, there's an application you can bring for a change of venue where there's a lot of media attention and negativity. I know it really doesn't make sense in today's modern world with internet and things, but back then, was that ever a discussion that you had with your lawyer about maybe trying to get to another jurisdiction?
We had a brief discussion with him about it, and I asked him to do it. I told him I wanted him to do it, but he told me he thought it was frivolous, that the judge was not going to grant it, and so he never took the time to file the motion and try.
Okay. So Jeff, when you learned that the jury had found you guilty and you received your sentence, what happened after that? What was going through your mind?
So that was like two separate things. So I was found guilty, and then I was immediately taken. I was taken into custody. So the bail was over, and it felt like I was in a nightmarish alternative reality. I mean, because up to that point in time, I thought that only guilty people were found guilty. So that aspect of it. But another thing, like I remember when I first heard them say guilty, because they found me not guilty of the first three charges, because they get charged me with different theories of murder, different degrees of murder, and I was found not guilty of the first three. And then when they said guilty, I'm thinking, well, wait, did I just hear that right? Did I miss the word not? Did I not hear that? So I just remember just kind of being stunned, and as I was taken into custody, I didn't know what was going to happen to me at that point. You know, on the day of the sentencing, that was a very traumatic thing, and I begged the judge to overturn the verdict, and I referenced the DNA to support my contention that I was innocent, and for him to then say to me, "Maybe you are innocent," you know, and then give me a 15 to life sentence. I didn't know what was going to happen to me at that point.
Yeah, and to have that comment put to you that maybe you are innocent, but here's your sentence. I mean, that I can't, again, I just can't. So many parts of your story I just can't possibly imagine. But you did, Jeff, during the sentencing, my understanding is that you did tell the judge that you were going to continue to fight.
Yes, I did. I did say that to him. Yes, yes. I was marching out of the courtroom. I think I said something to the effect that that I'll be free one day. I'm going to be that I'll be exonerated. Something to that. Those were not the exact words, but it is something that I said as I was led off, which the court reporter caught and typed up on the minutes. Yeah, something like that. Yes.
Was that kind of a changing moment for you then, that in your mindset that,
Yes.
okay, I'm going to continue to fight. I'm going to prove that I'm innocent.
Yes, because I needed to have something else to latch onto mentally. Hope was very important to be able to survive. And, I mean, the other way to just resign yourself to serving a 15 to life sentence. I mean, it's very hard to wrap your head around. So
Yeah.
I had to latch onto something, some scenario other than that, some kind of way other than that.
So I want to talk about your experiences in prison, Jeff. The horror of going to jail for a crime you did not commit is, again, truly hard to fathom. When you went to jail, how old were you?
So when I went to prison, I was 17 years old.
Can you describe your day-to-day in prison? What did it look like?
Sure. So I would say, well, there's a routine and there's the overall. So the overall was that it was very violent there. It was 3 or 4 stabbings or cuttings every day. There was a lot of violence that did not involve weapons, and there was a lot of gang activity. So cumulatively, there was a general environment of violence and adrenaline that permeated the air. There's a system of maintaining order in the prison known as keep lock, which involved a variety of sanctions being imposed on the prisoners if they were found guilty of breaking the prison rule. They would keep you in the cell 23 hours a day out of the 24. They would send you less food. Sometimes the food would be 3 or 4 days old. They would put you in a small area with a pull-up bar in it. If you were lucky for recreation, you could take 2 showers one week and 3 the next, rather than being able to shower daily as the rest of the population. You could not go to the store. You could not use the phone while you were on that status. So I had this bullseye on my back people discovered I was incarcerated for a sex offense, that could, motivate them to assault me. And so I always had that concern in the back of my mind. In the course of the 16 years, there were 6 or 7 times where I was assaulted. One time I nearly lost my life. I got hit multiple times on the side of my head with a 10-pound weight plate. But because I did the best that I could to defend myself, then as far as the prison administration was concerned, then I was fighting. So I was subjected to those penalties. Some of the guards were verbally abusive to the prisoners, and some of them, when they were working and they were in the area where I was, my only goal that day was to somehow escape their notice. The food was terrible. Sometimes it would be not fully cooked. At other times it would be burned. I was sent to a prison that was 4.5 hours away from home, so that made things difficult in terms of visitation. The guards did things to discourage my visitors from coming back, like they did to the other prisoners. I mean, they would be really slow about the visit processing, and they would take a long time before they would tell me that I had a visitor. So it was not uncommon for my mother to have been waiting 45 minutes up until several hours just by herself in the visiting room waiting for me to get there. My grandmother passed away while I was there. My brother was impacted by wrongful conviction. Kids in the school bus used to tell him that his brother was a rapist, and they would say other nasty things and try to hit him and stab him with pencils. So eventually he dropped out of school. He turned to drugs and alcohol, but eventually cleaned himself up. But he still retains a lot of the street mannerisms, and he's never returned back to school to get the GED. In terms of day to day, they would ring a bell around 6:30 in the morning, which is to let everyone know that they're going to be ringing the bell in 10 minutes after that to come around and do a count, which means they make sure that everybody is alive and that nobody has escaped. So they'd ring the bell around 6:30. They'd ring it again about 10 minutes later. They come around and do a count, and you have to either turn the light on. Depending on who was working, you might have to get dressed and stand up. Or if some of the other guards that let certain things go, they would allow you to just turn the light on, and that would be it. That would be sufficient. So then they'd ring the bell. They'd ring the bell at 6:30. They ring the bell 10 minutes again later, do the count. And then one more time, they'll ring the bell, and then they start opening up cells. And then you go to the cafeteria, which is referred to as the mess hall. And, you would stand on line, get your tray and get your food, pick up a metal spoon at the end, which you use to eat with. Then you have to sit down, and you can't get up again until the guards tell you that you can. But there's like one officer that's assigned to the whole cell gallery, so you'd be sitting there until they give permission for everyone to leave. So for all of the meals, they kind of played the sadistic game. So if the meal was halfway decent, they would rush us out of there within 10 minutes or less. But if the meal was not good, then you might be waiting 20 minutes, half hour, maybe even as long as 45 minutes. The area was poorly ventilated. There's a lot of body heat. So you leave the mess hall. You have to turn the spoon in to somebody counting that. The spoon, you go through a metal detector, and then from there you go to your morning assignment. So it might be educational, or it might be a vocational trade, or it could be a therapeutic program which is designed to address the crime for which you're incarcerated. At 11 o'clock, then they go back through the metal detector and go back to your cell, and they come and do a count. They ring the bell at 12 o'clock, and you come out and you go to the mess hall again, and then you go to the afternoon assignment, which was from like 1 until 3. You again go to the metal detector, and that's where the day would kind of divide. So if it was a night that they had recreation, then you would go back to your cell until dinner time around 4:45. Dinner would be optional. So at 5:45, dinner was finished, and then they would let you out for recreation at 7 o'clock, and you go back to the cell around 10. But if it was a day that they did not have recreation, then at 3 o'clock, then you'd go out to the yard for an hour. And then you go back to your cell, go through the metal detector again. They let you out for dinner around 10 to 5, and then you'd be back in the cell at 5:30, where you would stay there until the next morning, unless you had permission to leave your cell and go to some other area. Like you might go to a class or a Bible study or some other program. But unless you had what they call the call out, you would be stuck in your cell from 5:30 until the next morning.
Okay. And Jeff, you talked about how you were fighting for your innocence and trying to prove your innocence. And we'll talk about your appeal efforts here momentarily. But what strategies did you use to keep going while you were in prison?
Well, but definitely belief in God was one thing. Another thing was I thought that I was not doing a 15 or life sentence. I figured I was just doing a year or two till the next appeal was decided. So I kind of latched on to that. I used to go to the law library, and that gave me a sense of empowerment and comfort. I used to collect articles about other people who were exonerated, and I used that as motivation to keep going. There was another wrongfully convicted prisoner there named Frank Sterling, and we kept each other going for 13 and a half years. We would get together once every 6 weeks, and half the conversation would be about morale, and the other half the time we would just brainstorm about what the next tactic was to try. Frank was eventually exonerated through DNA testing after 18 years, a couple of years after I was released. Another thing was I engaged in this elaborate delusion where when I would play basketball or play chess or ping pong, I would pretend like I was a professional player and so were the other people. But it really wasn't like kids on a playground fooling around. I mean, this was more a defense mechanism, and I needed to get out of the prison for a couple of hours mentally, and so hence engaging that delusion. And you engage in euphemism, so you're not going to your prison assignment in the morning or afternoon. I'm going to school, or I'm going to work, or, it's not the prison warden, it's the superintendent. I would listen to sports talk radio, but it was not listening to sports talk radio. It was more like a lifeline to the outside. In 1998, they allowed us to purchase black and white televisions in the cell for the prison where I was at, Elmira Correctional Facility. And for the most part, the TV stayed off because I was writing letters looking for help, and I was reading nonfiction books. So from 1998 to 2006, I read 3 or 4 books a week. So for the most part, with all that activity, my television was off. But there were certain programs that I watched every week. And again, I kind of engaged in a delusion. When I would watch certain weekly episodes of a program, like I would pretend like I was visiting with friends. I collected pictures rather, of nature scenes, and I would hang them up in a certain area in the cell wall so that I could look at those and kind of travel to them mentally.
Okay. And as you just mentioned, you were reading a lot. You were also educating yourself and studying your case while you were there.
Yes, that's correct. And one more thing I want to add is I did place an ad the last couple of years. I did place an ad in a newspaper in California, actually, and somebody answered the ad. I was looking for a pen pal and for some outside contact, and I was hoping that at some point the conversation would wind its way around to, well, what are you doing in there? And I could explain that I was innocent, and maybe they can help build a bridge between me and the legal help. And so somebody did answer the ad, and we corresponded for several years. And I was literally asking him, look, do you think I should just quit? Do you think I should just give up? Maybe I should just go ahead and commit suicide. I mean, I'm never going to get out of here. And so that was another aspect of how I survived. And because so overall, mentally, I had to keep fighting off feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, thoughts of giving up, and thoughts of suicidal ideation. So it was very difficult for me in many ways.
Okay. And Jeff, I want to talk now about the appeal processes while you were in jail. Can you tell us how many appeals there were and what that was like?
Sure. So I lost 7 appeals. So walking you through the process, I went to the appellate division, the first court, where my issues were that I was innocent based on the DNA. So that took the form of my lawyer arguing. This was a different lawyer and a different public defender from a totally different agency. And the lawyer argued that there was legally insufficient evidence to find me guilty, that the prosecution had not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the verdict was against the weight of the evidence. She argued that my right against self-incrimination, my Fifth Amendment right, had been violated by the manner in which I had been questioned. She argued that my Sixth Amendment right to confront my accusers had been violated because the judge allowed the polygraphist to keep telling the jury that I failed the polygraph while banning him from questioning him about the method that he used to arrive at his opinion. The evidence being thrown out was another issue that was raised. The judge being biased was another issue. Altogether, 10 issues of law were raised. The court found nothing wrong with the way I'd been questioned. They ruled the statements were voluntary. They said that I could come and go as I wanted. They wrote that there was overwhelming evidence of guilt, which I don't understand because the DNA didn't match me. And then they got rid of all the rest of my issues in one sentence by writing that they had looked at the rest of my issues and found them either to be without merit or else not preserved for review. And they ruled against me 5-0. And from there, it was all downhill. The re-argument motion was denied in one word. Denied. The New York Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York, 2-step process. You have to ask permission to appeal to them, and only if they give you permission would you then be able to actually argue the case. So they declined to give me permission to appeal to them. I lost in federal court because my attorney was given the wrong information pertaining to the filing procedure from the court clerk. So my being 4 days late was deemed to be more important than the substance of the issues that I was arguing. So then I challenged that ruling at the Federal Court of Appeals. Future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor was one of the 2 judges that heard the argument. My lawyer argued that this was not a delay caused by me and my attorney, but by the misinformation by the court clerk, that upholding a ruling like that would cause a miscarriage of justice to continue, and that reversing the procedural ruling would open the door to more sophisticated DNA testing. Again, the district attorney opposed, and again, the court ruled with the district attorney. They upheld that ruling. a re-argument motion in front of those two judges wherein it was the defense requested all of the judges on the circuit hear the case and make a decision. That was denied. And then the U.S. Supreme Court also declined to give me permission. So that was the end of the legal appeals. When your appeal and also the end of legal representation. So when your appeals are exhausted, the only way back in a court would be if there's a retroactive change in the law, or else if there's some previously unknown evidence of innocence which is discovered that probably would have led to a different outcome. Hence my writing letters, I couldn't afford to hire an attorney or an investigator. So I wrote letters for 4 years trying to find someone to take my case for free to hope that they could find some new evidence. Then I went to the parole board where, because I maintained my innocence rather than expressing remorse and taking responsibility, I was denied parole. Ultimately, one of the letters that I wrote to an investigator, Claudia Whitman, I wrote a book author in care of the publishing company, but someone instead sent the letter to Claudia Whitman, and she believed in my innocence based on the DNA not matching me, and she tried to get people to take my case, and one of her ideas she gave me proved to be the winning one. She suggested I write the Innocence Project again, which works to free wrongfully convicted prisoners nationally in the United States in cases where DNA testing could demonstrate innocence and in which no prior testing had been conducted. Yeah, so getting their representation was the first key. She lobbied them from outside the organization to take the case. One of the intake workers also presented my case several times to the lawyers, for a total of 3 times before they finally agreed to take it. So getting representation was the key. Second thing was former Westchester District Attorney Janine Pirro, who had fought me all of my appeals and blocked me from getting further DNA testing. She left office, and her successor allowed me to get further testing. And thirdly, we got lucky that we put the DNA, which already didn't match me, into the database, and it matched the actual perpetrator, whose DNA was only in the data bank because left free while I was doing time for his crime. He killed his second victim 3.5 years later, who was a school teacher and had 2 children. So on September 22nd, 2006, my conviction was overturned. I was released. I reported back to court November 2nd, 2006, at which point all the charges against me were dismissed on actual innocence grounds, and he was arrested and convicted for the crime. Just want to add that, confronted with the DNA matching him, he admitted that he was the person.
Wow. So, Jeff, the DA that had fought you all along the way, all your appeals,
Yeah, Janine Pirro. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a theory of, was it tunnel vision, ego, noble cause, corruption? Do you have a theory of why she was so adamant to not even test the DNA?
I think that it was tunnel vision, but then but other people were wrongfully convicted under her tenure, and and withholding evidence and other unethical tactics were not anything new. So that kind of fit into the overall pattern. So, for example, Keon Katibi and Selwyn Days eventually were exonerated, and those were people whose convictions happened under her watch. So maybe both of those factors. So yeah, the tunnel vision I think was part of it, and then also, she just kind of ran kind of an unethical, at times against the law, against the ethics type of way. I think both of those aspects were factors.
So then when the Innocence Project gets involved and a new DA comes in, was the DA receptive then to,
Yes.
run? Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah, so she agreed to let me get the testing, so I give her credit for that. And then she agreed to have the conviction overturned, so I give her credit for that too. And ultimately, she agreed that all the charges against me should be dismissed on actual innocence grounds. And they also, as I mentioned, the actual perpetrator was arrested and convicted. So I give credit to the DA's office for all 4 of those steps in connection with my case.
Yeah, and one of the things that is discussed too is that you're in prison for 16 years and the real culprit is out on the lam. They're loose, and he committed another crime in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. Another person lost their life as a result of that. Sure, and then the victim's family as well. I mean, they learned that this person that they believed had committed the crime for 16 years, actually didn't. That was hard for them too.
So, Jeff, I want to talk about the reintegration process from leaving prison to going back into society after 16 years. What was that like? How difficult was that?
Extremely difficult from a variety of perspectives. So, firstly, the world was much different than it was before. So, technologically, GPS, cell phones, internet had not been created. Culture was different. Cities and towns did not look the same. They looked just familiar enough for me to recognize them, but very different. And the people that I knew that inhabited various cities and towns didn't live there anymore. So taken cumulatively, it felt like I was in a parallel world, one that where I didn't belong at. I had psychological after effects from the experience. So it's common for people who've been wrongfully convicted to have PTSD, panic attacks, anxiety, similar ailments such as, other ailments with that, fear on seeing law enforcement, altered personality, feeling of processing things at a slower speed, feeling of having been frozen in time. So I used to see mental health professionals 4 times a week for 6 years. There was a stigma attached to me. I was wrongfully imprisoned. Yes, but I was in prison for 16 years. So how much of that rubbed off on me? Is it safe to be alone someplace with me? So that definitely posed a challenge when it came to personal relationship. I was released with nothing, and I was always passed over for gainful employment. So as a result of that, it was hard for me financially, and for a couple of years, I lacked stability of housing. At one point, I was only a couple of weeks away from being in a homeless shelter. But then Mercy College, which gave me a scholarship to finish the bachelor's degree because I had completed GED and associates, and then the year towards the bachelor's when funding was cut for college education for prisoners. So the fact that I was that short of the bachelor's had made its way as a human interest item into one of the articles about my case. And that one of the deans of Mercy College saw that, and so she arranged for me to get a scholarship to finish the bachelor's. They gave me a meal plan, so I was able to eat. That was helpful to eat. And then they allowed me to live on campus, and that was how I avoided the homeless shelter. Wanted to share that it was it was awkward. It was awkward when I would meet up with members of my extended family that had either never come to see me or had come to see me on a very limited basis. In many ways, I essentially did the time by myself. I mean, the last 5-6 years, my mother would come once every 6 months, and my brother came 3 times in 16 years, and not all the last decade, and a couple of sets of aunts and uncles would come, then disappear for 3 years, and repeat that cycle. So in many ways, though not literally, I did do the time essentially by myself, and so it was awkward when I would meet up with them because I knew who they were intellectually, but I was a different person now, and so were they. So the advancement and developed aging was all they were different now as well. But it was particularly a challenge for me to reintegrate because of the years that I was in prison from age 17 to 32. So what normally happens there, there's rites of passage. So I had never before lived on my own. I hadn't had a driver's license. I had never gone shopping before. I had never had to write a check. I never had to balance a budget. So all of that made things difficult. I was released when I was 32, but I felt like I was 17 because that was the age at which I was last free. In terms of what I lost out on, I didn't graduate high school. I hadn't had a chance to go to prom. I didn't finish my college education at a more traditional age. I wasn't along the way in a career. I didn't have a family. So all those things were very challenging. But at the same time, when I gave the press conference when I was exonerated, there was a ton of media there, and I gave an off-the-cuff 2.5 hour presentation of everything I ever wanted to say in 16 years, but could not get anyone to hear me. And so it all came out, and I realized then that I could be an advocate without necessarily being an attorney. And so I began doing speaking engagements across the country. I caught on as a weekly columnist. They only run 1 article a week though, so it was not a lot of money. But I started doing media appearances, and I started meeting with elected officials.
Okay. Is that what kind of led you to the desire to become a lawyer yourself, Jeff?
Yeah, that was part of it. So after I finally was compensated, which took about 5 years, I wanted to do more than the policy and public education aspect. I had kind of nibbled on the edges of cases before, like I would show up in a courtroom for the visual impact on the judge. Maybe, they would pay a little bit more close attention to that particular, that case. Or sometimes I wrote about cases in my capacity as a columnist, while the injustices were still afoot. And I also allowed my name to be used sometimes in media advisories. But that was kind of nibbling on the edges, and so I wanted to be more involved in the freeing people. So I took $1.5 million from what I got, and I started the Deskovic Foundation for Justice, and we have been able to get 11 people home, and we help able pass 3 laws pertaining to wrongful conviction prevention. So DNA database expansion, videotaping interrogations, identification reform. I am an advisory board member of the coalition group It Could Happen to You. which the foundation is part of, and we were able to help pass five additional laws, including independent oversight for prosecutors, discovery reform, which pertains to sharing information early in the process between the defense and the prosecution, and able to help pass a law in Pennsylvania pertaining to automatic expansion. So there's currently chapters in New York, Pennsylvania, and California of that coalition group, and I'm active in all three of those chapters. So I regularly meet with elected officials in all those states, and I'm also the liaison from the coalition to the exoneree community. But at some point, I became not satisfied with sitting in the front row of the courtroom. I wanted to be able to represent some of the clients and make some of the arguments, hence becoming an attorney. When I did finish the bachelor's degree, I then got a master's degree in criminal justice from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and my thesis was written on wrongful conviction, cause, and reform. And then I am an attorney as well. So my views on wrongful conviction prevention and criminal justice reform in general are shaped by not just my personal experience, but what I learned on the master's level and in law school, and then also informal study. So it's not based only on my experience.
And Jeff, your efforts to bring about change in the criminal justice system, there was a recent development in New York State, as I understand it, passed in June of 2021, where legislation was passed that allows for prosecutorial misconduct to be addressed and disciplined. Can you tell us about that and your role in bringing that to passing?
Yes, so it's called Commission on Prosecutor Conduct. So it's an independent oversight board which investigates allegations of prosecutorial misconduct, and they would then report their findings to the grievance committee, which would decide the punishment. So basically, with no oversight, the prosecutorial misconduct, kind of became prevalent. So they have immunity, so you couldn't sue them. They don't face criminal consequences. If they get caught committing misconduct, the court does not automatically reverse the conviction. They try to determine whether the error is harmless or not. And if they thought that it was, then they would not reverse the conviction. And so with nothing in place to restrain them, misconduct became pervasive. So like the prosecutor in my case, running to the grand jury the day before officially getting the DNA test results, not saying the proper evidentiary foundation, not turning over the fact that the medical examiner who committed the fraud, he had been complained of in neighboring counties by authorities for not giving truthful testimony. And, this prosecutor and the medical examiner, there were three other cases that they worked on together where this medical examiner altered his findings in order to better fit the prosecution theory. So based on that, I worked on passing this commission. So the key factors were that the grievance committee and the bar associations, they weren't doing anything about misconduct, and even cases where people were exonerated, it was clear that prosecutorial misconduct had played a factor, hence championing that legislation. So my role in it was I was an advisory board member of that coalition group. We started out with the idea and we built out a whole statewide coalition throughout New York consisting of exonerees, people falsely accused but acquitted, criminal justice reform organizations, individual advocates, unusual partners. So we had like teachers unions and labor and people in the hotel, restaurant sectors, friends and family of people who alleged that they were wrongfully imprisoned, formerly incarcerated people, and just everyday concerned citizens concerned with justice. So we formed this coalition and we waged this 8-year fight to get the legislation passed. I mean, the District Attorneys Association of New York, their position was they hear them tell it that the present system was just fine, that there was very little prosecutorial misconduct, that to the extent that it occurred, it was only by inexperienced prosecutors who didn't have enough training and that they were able to discipline their own. But, the facts really didn't bear that out. I mean, there'd been very little discipline. And attorneys were not willing to file complaints because they knew they were worried about personal repercussions and that future clients would suffer repercussions that plea bargains that would normally be extended would not be. And they knew that nothing was going to happen anyway. And there was no subpoena power. So hence the need for this commission, which was passed and signed into law. So I was one of the main advocates. So I was involved in a lot of the strategic conversations amongst the coalition. I met with a lot of elected officials. I participated in press conferences. I did individual interviews. My case was referenced a lot. I was the liaison to the exoneree community, so we would bring in lots of other exonerations and exonerees in order to illustrate that wrongful conviction was not this rare thing. And so that was my role in helping to pass that.
Right. And kudos to you, Jeff, because your foundation and the work that you're doing is all important, and it must be satisfying to see your hard work paying off.
Yeah, it definitely was. And I like to see that my suffering counted for something. And, my mission in the world is to fight wrongful conviction, to free people wrongfully imprisoned, and the policy work, which is important because it prevents it, and even some broader justice reform. And I make sense of everything in that way. And I have a sense of purpose and mission in life, and I have the inner peace, which is really important for me. And when people ask me, and by the way, it's healing, it's cathartic. People ask me sometimes, well, are you angry? And, I want to enjoy my life as much as I can. I can't do that if I'm angry or bitter. I feel like I lost so much as is. Why would I want to, in effect, lose the rest of my life? Which, and I would really be the only loser in that scenario. And the way that I actualize that is I take the energy that I feel and I channel it into the advocacy work that I do.
Right. And that was going to be along the lines of a question I was going to ask you, is how you were able to overcome what would be understandable hostility towards the justice system, police, lawyers, to do the work that you're now doing. And your story, Jeff, is inspiring in that way, because you're using your experiences and now your education to bring about positive change. So what advice would you give to listeners then when it comes to overcoming adversity?
Yeah, I would say have a goal, have a realistic plan. You should be able to look at your plan 3 or 4 different ways and think that it has a chance. Be flexible. Remember that the goal is the goal. The plan is not the goal. So if an unexpected door opens for you, and as long as it moves you towards your goal, and you're also comfortable, then go ahead and do it. There are no reasons why you can't accomplish something. There's only reasons why something that might be more difficult. Work really hard and never quit, never give up. And whenever you can't go on anymore, just say to yourself, maybe this is the key moment right here. And if I would have kept going, I could have had a breakthrough. But because I quit, that it's not going to happen. So even though I can't go on anymore, I'm going to do so anyway, and just to see what happens on the other side. And when you do make it, when you do overcome, then, reach back and help similarly situated people and do some work on the preventative side. And if you can do that, it'll be healing, it'll be cathartic, it'll be meaningful. Your suffering will have counted for something, and you'll make you help make the world a little bit better. And I know that message goes well beyond wrongful conviction or justice reform. People can apply that in a wide variety of challenging settings, whether it's domestic abuse survivor or someone who's homeless or someone who overcame some debilitating illness, or maybe a sexual assault survivor or someone's been trafficked. I mean, I've seen advocates that have a similar mission to me, just in their own respective fields, that, were people that were personally impacted, and they did come out the other side, and they do help similarly situated people and do something preventative. And I find that to be inspiring. Or could be someone that was discriminated against, or somebody who suffered racism, you name it. Could be something huge, could be something lesser relative to the other things, but that message is universal. And speaking of universal, I have one of the key things I've really been able to do is position justice reform as being about justice and accuracy rather than anti-law enforcement or anti-prosecutor. It's not against cops or prosecutors. I'm definitely against cops and prosecutors when they break the law, when they run over state and constitutional rights and proper procedure. But if you're doing your job correctly in that field, I see both of those professions as really, essential services. And, so, I mean, there is the wave going on in the U.S. now, the thought, defund the police. And look, my own position on that is, if I call 911, I don't want to be put on hold. Okay. I want a police officer showing up at the scene. I don't want a social worker or a psychologist. I do want better training for dealing with people with mental health crises. And I want people held accountable in the same way a civilian can and should be held accountable if they break the law. I think the same thing as to law enforcement. I categorically reject the attempted explanation, the rhetoric, the talking point. Oh, it's just a few bad apples. No, it's a lot more than that. It wouldn't be 2,805 exonerations in the National Registry of Exoneration in the U.S. We wouldn't see brutality or unjustifiable deadly police force if it was a few. But there's also quite a few good people in those professions. And, and in posing that message, I have gotten some buy-in through law enforcement. So For the last 7.5 years from so far, I have co-taught the ethics class at police academies with another noble cause corruption, as you alluded to earlier. I did serve on the transition team for the new Westchester County District Attorney in terms of guidelines for her conviction review unit. I did help train police agencies in the state of Jujuy in Argentina, and I did serve on the Peekskill Police Task Force Reform Group. I was assigned to the policy subcommittee where I worked with the sitting Peekskill Police Chief, a county police officer, a retired detective, and we were able to get consensus on a number of improved police procedures calculated to improve the accuracy. And one of the key messages that I share at the academy after discussing my own case, which I frame as kind of like example of one case, and then I transition to what best practices are that they could voluntarily implement. You can review the confession, you can familiarize yourself with the red flags and, were suspect, did you ask open-ended questions or did you just ask yes, no? Did you give any details, unintentionally and, using the best practices as far as identification, and did you give completely truthful testimony in your court appearances, or did you test a lie? Did you keep everything 100% accurate in your police reports? If you're a supervisor, did you review a confession? Did you review the circumstances under identification? And really, the police in my case could have wrote a totally different narrative. They could have been the hero. They could have, well, wait a minute, hold on. We found these problems right here. Something's not quite right here. So the police lieutenant in litigation afterwards, he claimed that he had concerns, but he never expressed any of them. He was just content for me to do the 16 years, what turned out to be 16 years. So that's kind of my message when I speak, at the academy. And really, police are the first line of defense in preventing wrongful conviction. So if you don't arrest the wrong person, the train never pulls out of the station. And I do share, a cutting edge technique is, if there is an alternative suspect, can you prove how the alternative suspect could not have committed the crime? Can you independently prove each statement in a confession? So these are all things that could be done to enhance accuracy, and it starts on the law enforcement level. And so I've been able to get that buy-in, and I've been able to speak in front of various groups of judges, and I like being able to stand in the middle and try to be a uniter and bring people together on justice reform. And, I've spoken at rallies and said, look, you can't engage in violence. You can't engage in vandalism and destroying property, because the issue isn't about justice reform, the issues of which I agree with you in your cause. It's only about what your actions are. You're muddying the waters. You're making it more difficult for those of us engaging in justice reform. So I do stand in the middle there, and I push that message, and I've been received well by many different sides of that.
Well, certainly it's an important message, Jeff, and education and training for police, I think, is a huge part of this as well. And I'm happy to see that you are talking to new police officers, up and coming police officers, because I think that's very important. And on the line of education and sharing your story, in 2020, you teamed up with a filmmaker to make a documentary called Conviction, which details your story and your fight for freedom. Why was this an important step for you to take? Why did you want to participate in the documentary?
Because I wanted to further raise my own profile, the profile of the foundation and its work, and about wrongful conviction. So I did it for those reasons. And I utilized the platform that it gave me to bring attention to a lot of the non-innocence justice reform measures, things that I saw up close and personal, that I experienced, that I witnessed. I saw a lot of disturbing things. The punishment is supposed, when someone's incarcerated, is supposed to be the loss of your freedom. It's not to be mistreated while you're in prison. So in that documentary, I talk about things like prison reform and just trying to eliminate the verbal abuse from the guards to the prisoners, how I didn't really see that there was much effort to reduce the prisoner-on-prisoner violence. I discussed solitary confinement and people who were over-sentenced. I saw people that were incarcerated 20, 30 years for a certain percentage of drugs, and those people were sentenced to even more time than people that had killed people or committed other acts of violence. And I talked about elderly people in prison and how the medical care is terrible in prison, but that how it was particularly not suited for dealing with the advanced geriatric needs of elderly, and how prisoners who were guilty of serious crimes, but that was 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, and how they would go to the parole board. And the parole board's purpose is supposed to be to evaluate rehabilitation and whether if someone's released, if they would likely to remain at liberty without breaking the law, and how they would just rubber stamp deny parole applications to anyone who had been convicted of a violent crime, and how that was, the nature of the crime was something that was never there's nothing that ever can be done to change that. And that's what the judge already took into account in fashioning a sentence. And to deny parole based on that, is basically to abandon any pretense of believing in rehabilitation. So I discussed those things, and even, compassionate release, whereby if a prisoner is determined to be terminally ill by the prison medical team, how they can apply for compassionate release, in which they can spend their few remaining days with family, dying with some dignity in a normal environment, and how sometimes by the time the decision was made to grant it, the prisoner died already or was within, only had a day or two left. How all those things were not acceptable, to me at all. And so I used that platform to bring attention to those issues, hoping to spark further public discussion with the hope that that ultimately can culminate into some justice reform. And it was part of the discussion. There was another piece of legislation passed in New York whereby technical parole violations. So previously, if somebody would return, if they had a curfew and you're supposed to be in at 8 o'clock and you're there at 8:05 or 8:10, somebody could be returned back to prison for a year or two for that. And, now it's, now that's changed now, and you would, the maximum would be like 30 days on something technical violation, but you'd remain free, would not be incarcerated automatically. You'd be free pending the hearing.
So a lot of good information in there, Jeff, and I'll make sure that I post in our show notes a link to how people can access your documentary. And another talk that you gave that I really enjoyed listening to was your TED Talk, which will also be included in our show notes. And in that talk, you discussed steps to help prevent wrongful convictions. And we are getting to the end of our time here today, Jeff. And initially, I was going to kind of walk through each one, but I've kept you on very long here. So just in general, I just want to list a couple of them that you mentioned, and people can go and watch your TED Talk for more information. But the importance of recording all interviews and interrogations, prosecutorial oversight, public defense for the poor and better legal aid access, the importance of education and training, post-conviction integrity and review systems. So some of the themes that have kind of spanned our conversation today. But I will ask the general question, Jeff. Do you think the justice system in America is doing enough to prevent wrongful convictions at this point?
Definitely not. So there's all these deficiencies that you've referenced, and misidentification and lying informants, and throw those in there as well. There is remedial legislation which could address those, but those deficiencies remain factors now in many of the states in the United States, and certainly legislation nationally that would cover federal cases. Those same systemic deficiencies that have led to wrongful convictions in state cases apply as to the federal cases as well. So it's not enough is being done, because we still don't have videotaping interrogations in all the states. We still don't have better identification procedure. We still don't have that better statewide system of public defense that would limit caseload and have equal budget between the district attorney's office and the public defender's office. There's still not equal pay between both sides. Only New York has the Commission on Prosecutor Conduct, so we need to have that across the board. And there's still some states that don't have external evidence corroboration requirement, meaning that there's some places where people can still be convicted based only on informant testimony, whereas I'm saying there should be some additional piece of evidence that corroborates what's said. There are still 14 states in the United States that does not offer exonerated compensation. So all those steps, are still needed. And so you could really just be wrongfully convicted now just as easily as before. So I'm free because of DNA. It's a wonderful technology. I'm glad it's advanced, but it's not a panacea. It's only available in 5 to 12% of all serious felony cases. So that means at best there's 88% of the time that a case cannot be resolved that way. And if people are listening and you are an attorney, sometime in your lifetime, do consider to take one wrongful conviction case on pro bono in your lifetime.
Okay. And last question, Jeff. How can people support efforts to stop and identify wrongful convictions? Is there a way they can donate to your foundation, for example? What advice would you give?
Definitely. So there's a website called Patreon, which is for people that are willing to be recurring monthly donors. So imagine, for example, if 25,000 people donated $3 to $5 a month on a recurring basis, that would allow us to hire additional personnel, attorneys, investigators, paralegals, other essential personnel. That would allow us to increase the number of wrongful conviction cases that we could work on. It would allow us to expand policy work beyond New York, Pennsylvania, and California. So that's definitely a way you can not just donate, but then also share it, social media, word of mouth. If you have a higher profile publicly on whether it's on social media or in general, I'd love to have somebody else talk about wrongful conviction, reference the foundation, have the Patreon link in it. Those are certainly steps that people can take. There is the Amazon Smile program, whereby if you register for the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation on Amazon, they will donate a small percentage of your purchase without it increasing the cost to the consumer. So that's another thing. In terms of how people can find me, the website, www.deskovic.org, Deskovic. There is a web form there that people can email me through. I have a public figure page on Facebook. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn as well. So all of those things. My ultimate dream is to have a chapter of the foundation in each state and ultimately in each country, because I see wrongful conviction as a worldwide issue in countries where we don't hear a lot or even anything at all about wrongful conviction. It's not because they don't happen. It's because there's very few exonerations happening. There's very few people working on the cases there. So we'll be able to make that expansion as public support, allows us to. But that would be a wonderful legacy, and be able to free people. It would be incredible.
Absolutely. And I wish you all the best in your efforts, Jeff. And I'll make sure, as I said, get people to check out the show notes, because all the links, your social media handles will be included in our notes. Jeff, I can't thank you enough for speaking with me today. Your case, true miscarriage of justice, but it's also one that is just epitomizes perseverance and overcoming adversity. So it was a true pleasure to speak with you today.